I'm Monica Johnson with Marshall Weber, and this is Booklyn Calling. Hello, hello. Welcome to our show. It's Booklyn Calling again. This is where we talk about artists, libraries, and social justice. I'm Monica, and I'm here with Marshall as usual, and we're part of Booklyn Inc. We're an arts nonprofit located in Brooklyn, New York, on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. We created Booklyn Calling to amplify voices in the artist book field and to explore art making as a tool for community engagement and social change. And lately, if you've been listening, we have been going a different direction, exploring Booklyn's own history as an organization, how we got started, what we do, why we do everything that we do. And we can only answer that question to a certain extent. So for today, we invited two archivists to talk with us. And full disclosure, they're also our clients. But we like to think of them as partners in bringing artist books and archival collections into use within educational spaces. So I would call it less of like a client, worker relationship, and more like co-facilitators in an endeavor. And one of the things I want to talk about is like, how are we partners, and how what is the Venn diagram crossover of what we're accomplishing together. So for us, for Booklyn, it comes from a deep desire to support social change and progress, and to also value artwork for its educational value, for its content, for its ability to invigorate critical discourse, and to do that around something tactile has a different kind of resonance than maybe like a screen-based learning. So these two people, Graham Stinnett and Kristin Eshelman, both work at University of Connecticut. I'm pretty sure they're both in Storrs, Connecticut, but they can tell me if that's true when they come on. So they both have individual bios, and I am going to read them through because I actually think they're interesting, and I think they're going to help us shape the conversation, and it might help dear listener to contextualize a lot of the things that they're going to offer the conversation. So first up is Graham Stinnett. He's an archivist who oversees the human rights and alternative press collections of archives and special collections at the University of Connecticut Library. He holds an MA in Archival Studies from the University of Winnipeg, University of Manitoba, and a BA in History from the University of Manitoba. His work focuses on the archivist as activist, very cool, and expanding access to archives for a diverse audience. He's the host of D'Archive, which I just learned how to pronounce. It is D''archive, pronounced D'Archive, an archives radio show and podcast, as well as curator of a traveling punk rock exhibition called Live at the Anthrax, Connecticut's Hardcore History. Graham currently teaches undergrad courses on archives, memory, and popular culture. Okay, now we're going to reset, and we're going to learn about Kristin Eshelman. She is the archivist for multimedia collections at the same Archives and Special Collections at University of Connecticut. She manages collections of special archival materials, including photography, film, sound recordings, and artist books. In 2015, she became archivist for the Northeast Children's Literature Collection. Kristin has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Washington College and a Master of Library Science, an MLS, from the University of Arizona. Postgraduate education in photography led her to a career in photo archives. And from 92 to 95, it's 1995, she trained at the Center for Creative Photography at University of Arizona. And from 1996 to 2001, she served as photo archivist for the Kansas collection of University Archives at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library at the University of Kansas. Okay, Kristin and Graham, how are you doing today? Say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
I promise I won't talk for that long anymore, but just wanted to get us started with some groundwork so that we can build on that. And I thought a nice way to start would just sort of be at the beginning and see, how did University of Connecticut and Booklyn meet? What was the nature of that relationship building? And like, what is it like to work with Booklyn? We're actually interested to hear, like, from your perspective, like, what is that like?
So I've been at the University of Connecticut since 2001. And I, like a good archivist, I had to go back to the historical record to see when I first met a Booklyn representative. And it wasn't Marshall, it was Emily Larned. And I think I met her in 2002. So at the time, my colleague Rutherford Wittes, who was the curator of literary collections and rare books, had somehow become acquainted with Booklyn. He knew that I was interested in creative process and in art, and he said, "Hey, I meet with these folks every once in a while. Do you want to join me?" And I think the first purchase I ever made from Booklyn was 2003, I think, 2003 or 2004. At the University of Connecticut, we had been showing some interest in artist books and had been meeting with some other dealers and a few individual artists I know as early as 2001. And yeah, that's really how it all got started. And more archivists in our shop, and we are 7 total archivists in the office here. And they other people were getting involved. Other people in the office, other archivists were interested in what they could do with artist books in our teaching and connecting students with them. It's been a long relationship and a really positive one, and our thinking about artist books and how we use them has absolutely evolved.
And to kind of contribute, I guess, from that middle point forward, if we're looking at this as a almost 20 plus, 23-year relationship, mine having come in 2013, so started in 2012 here at UConn. My first purchase with Marshall was the OccuPrint series, and we still bring that out, even though I was jokingly saying to Kristin, like, the kids on our campus have no idea what Occupy Wall Street is at this point. So it is our job to fortunately draw from what feels like not that too distant of a past to keep bringing out that kind of material. So it's really nice to almost have portfolios that feel like historical at this point, even though I feel like I just bought that and it just included it in the collection. And in an additional piece, not to blow up Emily Larned any more than she needs, but she is on faculty here now at the School of Fine Art. And she is a user, of course, a patron of ours, and brings her classes in regularly and knows a lot of the artist books that Kristin has more of a relationship with, in addition to sort of zines and other things in our collections that are of value. But having that sort of arc between the sort of worker staff of Booklyn also now being in our wheelhouse, and then maintaining this relationship through Marshall and through Monica and Jan, has also really elevated our ability to, I would say, activate a lot of the collections that we have that have led to programming opportunities. And I can talk more about this, but having worked with Marshall directly, who knows, an immense network of social justice artists who are regular contributors to these kinds of portfolios that I am interested in incorporating into the alternative press collection, has led to these opportunities for students to come see what process looks like, what maybe an archival object could then do out in the street, for action X or campaign Y. And it gives them a lot more of a sense outside of our, quiet corner here of Connecticut of what activating those sort of mediums of the past used in service of social justice can look like in a contemporary world.
I want to hear from Marshall. Like, what do you remember any of these building blocks and the early days of getting to know UConn?
Yeah, well, Emily went to Wesleyan, which was how the connection came apart. I did a presentation at Wesleyan. Susie Taraba was the special collections librarian there, and she was a big supporter of Booklyn. Emily, when she was a student, saw that presentation, did an internship in the summer, graduated, came on staff, came on the board as vice president, and then started to do other libraries, visit other libraries in Connecticut. I kind of don't remember a lot of that stuff from back at that period of time, but I do remember that Kristin was definitely the first librarian I met at UConn. And me and Kristin kind of hit it off. We had similar concerns in terms of librarianship and access and pedagogy. So it's just been an amazing relationship because it's revolves around collection development and the acquisition of books, but there's a much larger ongoing conversation about pedagogy and fair labor and the differences between state and private universities and colleges and the interface of union culture and university culture. And I'm always very happy because whenever I go visit, almost every time there's some Booklyn material on exhibit in one of the 3 exhibition spaces. There's a lobby gallery, the main reading room gallery, and then there's a designated discrete gallery for very kind of more in-depth exhibitions. And I've really always appreciated that programming.
When, I was just thinking about the history of our relationship with Booklyn and looking back at some of the documentation that I created over the many years, even as early as 2008, we were already seeing that the artist books that we had acquired for the collection, which at that point might have only been a couple hundred, they were getting a lot of use. We were buying curricularly. We were buying so that students would use the work. So we were trying to kind of match things up with what they were doing in class and just wanting them to get as much exposure as possible. And there was so much use of the collection that we were already in 2008 starting to see wear and tear on the books and thinking to ourselves, well, we don't have the kind of collection development budget that would allow for us to create like mirror collections. We're not collecting comprehensively in any way because we just don't have the funds to do that. And really making a sort of conscious and documented decision to say, these works are meant to be used. We don't really care. That's just fine. It's fine what is happening. But really sort of being conscious of that idea and then documenting it. It's important that our collections get used. And how even do we, as a group of archivists, get excited about what we have and get other people excited about what we have? How can we get these objects to start talking to one another? These are the kinds of internal conversations that we've had over the years, and just getting as many people involved as possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love the willingness to want to use the materials. And as an archivist, that's not always a typical response. It reminds me of one of my favorite sayings, which I learned through my volunteering at Interference Archive, which is use as preservation, which didn't start there, but kind of, is pervasive there. But yeah, you mentioned art students. that you work with, and that hits a chord with me as a former art student. Marshall, you're also a former art student, although it's been many years for both of us. And so when I think about my development, it took a long time to understand, and it wasn't that long ago that archivists and librarians purchase artwork for collections. I wonder if there's a paradigm shift that happens with art students you work with in the similar way that I experienced one, which was that something that was different than what the commercial market is as the dominant trajectory for art degrees or people coming out with art degrees. I wonder if you could talk about like what your like a little bit about the policy and how that makes a clear direction to using artist books, or how that makes sense, whether you're talking to an art student or you're talking to somebody who's negotiating a budget for collections. Like, what place does artwork have in research, I guess?
Yeah, wow, there's so much to say there. And even, again, this is something that evolves over time. I mean, like I said, I started here at UConn in 2001, and I had the benefit of a colleague inviting me to purchase artist books for the collection as early as 2003. So I, barely had any time at all. And immediately we were thinking about, why would we buy these things? What is it about them that's interesting for our collection? I used to really fuss at the beginning, just sort of personally, I would think about, when I'm presented with work that I could potentially add to the collection, what is my criteria? Am I considering only the curricular use? Am I considering, some other idea of permanence value? And I just had to keep using my experience with classes and students in the classes and the faculty and what they were trying to do in the art program to guide me. We had formal concerns in terms of adding art objects to the collection, but we also had interest in subject matter, in diversity, and each one of us, the way we do collection development here, each one of us really has the authority to make decisions about adding material to the collection as it relates to our areas. But even the concept of having collecting areas has evolved in the sense that when we began to conduct our collection development in a more collaborative way, we also were trying to respond to the use of our collections in a less predefined way. So, the sort of old way of thinking about archivists working in special collections is you have curators for particular subjects or particular types of material, or you have archivists who are responsible for collecting in a particular lane. So we have, our literary collections. We have, in the case of Graham, was hired to be the human rights archivist. Those categorizations are sort of helpful in the sense of managing how much work an individual employee has. But we, the archivists, really started to see those definitions and people's preconceptions of what that meant to just be getting in the way. So what we really wanted to do at some point was just kind of get rid of all that, because we didn't want to even view the collections that way. Even the legacy collections, the collections that were already here, because, we also we want to have respect for those collections. We don't want to be the type of special collection where, we're the new crew. So we're adding these new materials to the collection and we don't even look at that old stuff anymore. Right. So that's not that isn't the way we want this to go either. We want these materials to, we're throwing this word around, activate. We want them to activate one another. We want to be able to pull from lots of different things to give a student a really inspirational experience. We want them to be curious. So we are doing everything that we can to kind of make these things kind of talk to one another, so that they can be exposed to as much as possible. The student, my experience with the fine arts students is they just need exposure to as many things as possible.
Right.
And that's really the best thing that can be done.
That's interesting because that was one of the things that I like most about working with UConn. And I do think it relates to the identity of a fairly, in terms of the, timeline of the country, a fairly new institution as opposed to all the older private colleges and universities that are in some ways have the resources of these old collections, but in some ways are weighed down by these old collections. I think by about a decade, it seemed that you and Graham and the other people at UConn were collecting things that were where there was a focus on contemporary work resonating with whatever else was in the archives or in the other library collections. You were much more open to seeing political ephemera as art, to seeing political ephemera as being important under subject headings. There was a real focus on diversity much earlier than there was in some of the other surrounding collections. So that to me as a curator, I knew that I could go see you guys with a much wider spectrum of work, and a lot more outliers and a lot more political ephemera, and that you were much more open to seeing that work as relating to your collections, but also seeing it as serving the students, and even in terms of, and I would key off our meetings, and we always had great conversations during our meetings, but I'd also key off the exhibitions, because a lot of your exhibitions are kind of mirrors for the students to look at themselves by, collections about student activities in the past during the 60s or diversity issues in the 70s and 80s. Some faculty members' T-shirt collection. Like, there was more of an engagement in popular culture. And so for me, that was a lot of fun, but it also kind of developed a respect for the kind of the group curatorial perspective. A lot of times Graham and Kristin and Monica would sit in the room and they would talk about what they were going to acquire as a collective. And that was a really great mirror, because Booklyn, more and more as we grew, we started to curate collectively. So that process really moves away from the, like you said, the lane method. Well, we've got a poetry collection, so we're going to collect poetry, or we have a Civil War collection, so we're going to collect that. Where you can still collect along subject headings, but you're looking at the interrelationship of all the materials in a much more complex way, with a focus on keeping it relevant for students, not letting this kind of static trajectory determine collecting along very specific subject heading lanes or formal lanes, but seeing the interrelationship of all those things. And I really appreciate that. It led to some great conversations, and it led to, I think, the building of a very strong, relevant collection.
I love hearing that perspective. Thank you for sharing that with me, because, I want Graham to come in here too, because, what he's doing in his classes is, it's not the same as what I am asked to do by the fine arts faculty and what I'm trying to do with the young artists. I said they need to have exposure, but sometimes it's just it's down to the formal qualities of the work. They need to actually see what a certain kind of sewn binding looks like, or they need to see more photography. They just need to actually look at prints, or they need to actually look at, they'll bring their own ideas to their own art making. It's not so much that I'm trying to necessarily tap into those, but what I'm trying to do is help them to have the tools that they need to express themselves through their art the way they want to. So I don't know, Graham, maybe you have something you want to say about how you're using the materials that we've acquired in your class.
Yeah, yeah, and even to just foreground it, one of our collecting policies and also missions is something that I believe Kristin authored, which is the phrase that archives are for everyone. And that has really been kind of a guiding principle about how we, go across collecting areas to mirror a lot of times either a contemporary political moment on campus or just a cultural event. That has some, predominantly local context to it. Something that I try and do a lot in my collecting areas about are kind of trying to pull back maybe from where the collection of human rights began, which was like capital H human rights. As Marshall mentioned, the Nuremberg trials is one of our collections, and that's definitely like a legalistic framework for how we talk about the principles of human rights, and it's very specific, and it deals with big heavy consequential things of historical moments. But the small h human rights is something that kind of happens on our landscape every day. It relates to social justice and a lot of organizing principles that people have used in this place, speaking specifically about our campus, but also the surrounding communities and in the state of Connecticut. So we try and ground a lot of our idea of archives being for everyone as sort of the public service facing principle of like why we do what we do, and then turning that into things like exhibition, things like tabling events, even having the podcast, trying to just like bring these things out of that maybe stuck past that has really become a caricature of not just what we do, but academia generally. Like academia is in the crosshairs of just about anyone who is in power right now. And that's something that I think we are always kind of working against. So yeah, so just trying to use any of the things that really pop to get kids' attention in the classroom is a big part of why I feel like acquiring, poster collections, banners, things that are stained and covered in dirt but need a little bit of dusting off, but making them reading room ready is another phrase of ours for when we process materials that come in from an old activist's closet, and we get to show them like the history of the anti-Klan movement in Connecticut and then map that onto how people on this campus are advocating against like the rise of white nationalism or something like that. So, I would say my collection has a lot more to do with like the mid 20th century activist ideas and the formats in which they have been documented. And that's kind of like the connection that I can make with students about the past and the present, but through these different temporal moments that kind of need to be confronted in a lot of ways as the university changes.
Yeah, I mean, really simply, youth, student, and popular culture focused collecting sounds like it's just something that is common in terms of archival and special collections and artist book collections. But again, you guys were a little bit ahead of the curve because I think with a lot of the artist books collections are kind of developing from fine press collections and can be a little stodgy and a little elitist and a little focused on material forms and categories and taxonomies. And a lot of those, I think those larger structures affect even granular collecting. I mean, Booklyn is a not-for-profit. We are one of the only not-for-profit so-called book dealers, distributors in the country, where most of the book business is controlled by private distributors. So I just like the holographic nature of those larger issues kind of informing the discussions that happen in the rooms when we're actually looking at materials. And you're deciding, first, me and other curators are deciding what we are going to show UConn, and then you are deciding what are we going to acquire from what we are being shown.
I really like this idea of archives are for everyone, and I think there's a lot that shares with Booklyn's approach to our education, which is like bookmaking is for everyone. And so trying to make those things accessible, free, or like affordable, despite the problematic nature of that word affordable, because people should be able to make their own books. And if more people could make their own books, they'd be making books that might meet you in these moments of wanting to build a more diverse collection.
We had a long tradition here of, under other previous directors, of doing public programming. That public programming, I'll say, was often sort of donor-based public programming, or with an interest in encouraging donors to give to the collection. But nonetheless, we did a lot that was public-facing, and maybe we just sort of, that was enough to train our brains to think we always have to be thinking about what's happening in terms of how we are perceived from the outside. And the outside was always defined as not just the campus community, not just the students, not just the community in which we sit in stores, but the public. It could be really anyone. And even in our we had a recent round of fellowships and grants that we've given for use of the collection. This has always been something that we've had in place, but this year we felt that we could give even more to support research in the collection. And we've had the most interesting, without getting ahead of the researchers, so I won't give you too many details, but we've had the most interesting proposals for research from all sorts. These are not just academics. These are artists, educators, academics, people who are interested in making art. You name it. We got a wide variety of proposals, but also with an interest in this sort of interdisciplinary approach to the collection and using artist book collections. So we're just thrilled by that, because we feel like that's also part of this evolution of how we're connecting the collections with people.
I wanted to pull back a little and talk about, for us, for Booklyn, Connecticut is interesting. Some of our closest relationships in terms of pedagogical dialogues happen with Trinity, with Wesleyan, with UConn, with Yale. And it's interesting to me that there's like this book culture in the state in general that's has been extremely supportive for what we do, both in terms of a market. We sell a lot of books in Connecticut, and but then also I think there is something else going on there. Maybe there's like something in the air that, but then, there is, the difference being that a state university has a different constituency, and that I'm just wondering, because this is sort of my interest. A lot of the work that you have acquired from us has been related to union movements. You were talking about the Occupy Wall Street being one of your first acquisitions, Graham, and that culture is really intriguing to Booklyn, because Booklyn has great affinities with union movements, and we tend to be pretty proud about our relationships with state universities across the United States, and our affiliations with public libraries, which goes back to, Booklyn feels like artist books are for everyone. Children's books for adults. And it's interesting that, again, that's reflected in the archives for everyone. And in the discussions that we have had around issues of labor equity and fairness, both in terms of the actual production of artwork, but also in terms of librarianship and academia in general. And I'm wondering if, that's apparent to you guys as much as it is to me, and how that affects maybe your programming and collecting.
I'm not conscious of it as much as maybe you are, Marshall. And, we have an awful lot of freedom in our unit when, once the budget is allocated to us, we're really just making decisions without much interference about what we're going to add to the collections.
We are basically doing everything. Each one of us oversees all of the functions of the archives, and that feels much more like a cooperative effort that we are equally remunerated for. We all have the same access to the same bargaining agreements. We're all in the same union. And I don't know if that situates us to just kind of like hunker down better in our fort here as budgets change, which has nothing to do with our labor relationship. But the state overall, of course, is another thing that is kind of being assaulted on a regular basis. So yeah, they kind of go hand in hand. Like if your workforce is strong, your budget should be strong too, to continue to acquire things that make this a return back to the community that is investing in it. So yeah, if that answers any of it. But in terms of the support of the artist's work, we have invested in a lot of these kinds of collections, like the OccuPrint, Voces de la Frontera, maybe the Iraq Veterans Against the War was one of these as well, where we're sort of an initial signer on to the purchase of whatever work ends up coming into a portfolio to allow the artist to make the work. So we definitely pride ourselves on kind of being a contributing element to reinforcing the collecting that we began, decades ago.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I can say, just from my empirical evidence, that when I first started in the 90s, it really seemed like there was some equity between state and private institutions. Librarians, archivists tended to be long-term. Like you were, I feel like I worked with the same cadre of people for like a decade across the United States. But then in the 2000s, you started to see more and more volatility in the private sector. And I think that has escalated. In terms of my experience with state university libraries, is that there is still a lot of retention, but within the private, especially the smaller colleges, there's been a lot of volatility. Where over the course of a decade, I might be working with 4 different librarians, even more. And there's exceptions, but in general, I feel like there is a stability maybe within the state library system and this isn't strange. I think we see this happening tailorist, gig workers throughout the American economy. But I see that very specific phenomenon across the country in that kind of divide between the private institutions and state institutions. And, the sad thing to think is that will go away soon also, as we corporatize all our state institutions as well. And that will be a great loss. So I was never a big fan of the 150-year-old guy in the basement who hadn't had FaceTime with a student or a researcher for decades. I mean, that was not a phenomenon I really liked. But in terms of what an archive and a library is, there's something to be said, because quite frankly, if you're going into a library that has a few million volumes, it might take you a decade to really know that collection. If a job ever deserved and needed long-term retention, it would seem like archiving and librarians' jobs would need that.
Yeah,
I would agree, Marshall. I mean, even just in my looking back at kind of how our collecting has evolved, or even just my own personal ideas about what it is I think I'm doing in adding these works to the collection. It does take time to kind of put your head around what you're doing and responding to the interaction that you witness that is had by the people using the collection. And then, you're thinking about, well, how can I get more of that? And and then you're trying to maybe change your mind. Maybe you've done something and you think, that's not working out, or that's a mistake, or whatever. I just think it does take time, and I suppose in our environment, as Graham has said, it has the working at the public university has been good. That's why a bunch of us have been here a long time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we don't want to be the guy in the basement who's never, we don't want that either. We don't like that.
I wanted to talk about exhibitions. And there's a couple things I just want to light up before we hear from y'all. One is that we at Booklyn are pretty consistently troubled to try to figure out how to measure impact of what we do, because we have relationships with you, and you do the work with the work once you get it, and that's the part that the artists we work with want to know about. So in this scenario of like let's say a commercial gallery or traditional gallery, and so I'm saying this knowing that both of you display the work and put it on exhibit where you are. So a traditional gallery would have somebody to contact every artist when they have an exhibition and say, hey, your work is here. Just so you know, add it to your CV, come visit, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many instances where the work within your collections, and I say your, but I mean every client we work with, makes exhibitions. And so, but it's not networked in the same way, whether it's to Booklyn or to the artist directly, or maybe it is. And so I'm curious to see like how you guys handle that, or see yourselves in the artist world, and to help them understand where their work is having impact beyond the acquisition moment or CV builder, whatever it is. So there's that. And then the other thing is, what business do books have on exhibition? And I'm banking on the fact that it has troubled you to the extent that we can relate to that, because books sometimes, not all the time, but are something you experience as an individual. It's progressive, it's time-based, you paginate things. And exhibitions sometimes are like you walk in and you get like an instantaneous vibe, or you can look at something on a wall together and comment on it. And books, as a medium have a different point of entry and access. And then the other thing is like, you likely have like vitrines and things that you're obligated to put things in. So how do you think through putting books on display safely for the public to see? And what are the pain points, and like how do you move through those?
I can speak to the first question. I think Kristin has a longer experience being one of the archivists that oversees the artist's book collection. But in terms of the sort of citation and reference work of exhibitions generally, just to make sure that the distinction is laid down between the sort of fine art gallery, we are typically exhibiting archival objects, which include paper, photographs, negatives, posters, newspapers, things that probably come out of a folder that have not been described at the item level to begin with. So typically, the donor is giving us material in their collection that they neither own nor have told us that is possibly in the collection. A lot of times we are doing the work of just drawing the potential patron or viewer to do the rest of the digging themselves. Now, that's not to say we don't cite the work that we have, but there is an immense amount of work trying to even create a digital version of an exhibition that you can only see in the reading room or in the Schimmelfing Gallery or in the front room where we have flat cases for very small, quick exhibitions. And when those even do get sort of a digital representation that you can kind of blast to the world, we are then pointing to, okay, here's a bibliographic record of archivists for Palestine, or the portfolio that has been cataloged in our sort of unified library catalog that then will list, okay, these are all of the already pre-filled fields in a MARC record of a catalog that say, okay, this has the work of Josh McPhee, this has been acquired by Booklyn, this was maybe used funds from a special account that we purchased it with. There's a ton of information out there. It's just going to be in something that is not sexy at all, but is very much crawlable. Like, it is the world of data and organization of data. So the information will exist if it can then get to that level of promotion.
Sort of related to the other question is, I think mainly our focus is on connecting. I mean, maybe our priority focus is on connecting the students we know we're going to see every semester with the work, and less the kinds of concerns that you're bringing up. We want students to understand what they're looking at. We want them to know they're looking at this artist, and this over here is a different artist. And as Graham said, we are constantly encouraging them to follow their curiosity and go the next step on their own outside of the context of the classroom or assignment or visit or whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, what about books on exhibition in general?
Yeah, we have grappled with this problem before. I think we don't lose sleep over it, though, because we get a lot of traffic with the work. So exhibition is just one of the ways that we share with people what we have, what we're interested in, what might be interesting to them. And we know that there are limitations, and it doesn't really make sense a lot of the time when you take an artist book and you put it in a case. But we get so much other traffic in other ways. We're connecting people with the work in other ways. So I think I can say I'm not losing sleep over that one. I don't know what Graham thinks, but
maybe the pieces that I have acquired that sort of fit a book format, I'm thinking about like Mike Taylor's work. A lot of it has, these these elements that are standalone in a way, like it doesn't really matter what page you turn it to. You get the sort of gritty, satirical, but yet pointed political message, which is what I'm trying to draw from for the specific exhibition. And, a lot of the stuff that we have acquired from Booklyn has these accordion elements, which are amazing. Of course, like the format in which that book takes will dictate how it can be displayed. And we have a weird set of spaces in which we can put these kinds of books and arrange them so that they have the biggest impact when they can. You're never really getting the full story with every single piece. You are getting a nugget. That nugget is to inspire and then draw you back to kind of take your own hooks and build from that in a research project or whatever it is you are interested in the past for.
I want to go back to what I said earlier on. When I go visit UConn and go to the library and I look at all the galleries, and I do report to the artists if they're showing there. And so, but I also have this fantasy of like some giant reporting system that every time, if people are not familiar with how reading room works and how archives work, every day people are looking at things. And I just dream that there's some system where, the artists get all notified about this. Because I think especially over the past few decades, artists are artists who are not interested in the commercial or corporate gallery system, who are working in the academic system, who have that same kind of educational kind of perspective on gallery shows that you just described, Kristin and Graham, where the gallery show is part of an educational process. It's a teaser. It's bait. It's inspiration to bring you in to something else in a more profound way. Artists are kind of catering to that in the work that they make, but they're also much more concerned that work gets used, that not just seen, but that work actually gets used. So if they have something in exhibit, they want to know about it. And they would really like to know if the work gets used. It's in academia, there's a citation system, right? That's not, it's a little bit more complex in the artist book and the educational gallery exhibition world. But I say to artists, your work is going to a public institution. It's going to be used forever. Like you may not have a big show at a museum somewhere where people look at your work for that like 3.2 seconds that most people look at a piece of art on an exhibit. I mean, you're going to have someone paging through your book somewheres, especially with an edition piece, perhaps many times. And maybe that will spur important research. Maybe that will be life-changing. Maybe that will be entertaining. People will laugh. They will cry. They will be inspired. And that's kind of what I love most about this educational lens of, using cultural objects as opposed to kind of the, I just want to sell it and move on, or I just want to buy it and move on. I guess it's obvious that I prefer it because I worked in this, I left the art world a long time ago. And it's so interesting that there is this egalitarian and functional kind of, educational perspective on what these exhibits mean in the context of an archive and a library. Because it's quite common now. I mean, across the United States, every special collections library has a gallery. I mean, it's not a dark little room where you go in and you look at something, really, you blow off the dust and stuff. I mean, it's really, there's a library, there's a coffee shop, there's a lounge, there's a reading room. It's just a very vital way of looking at culture.
I'd like to speak a little bit to that in terms of, like, I totally share that understanding and the desire by the artist to, want to see how work is employed. And it's almost like I want to just offer the there is the good faith similar to that we offer to the donor of a set of papers that they give us, that this has, we sign an agreement with them, which basically says like we're doing our best to ensure that not only does it survive generations going forward, but that it can be made as accessible as possible. The other side of that coin is a real worry of mine. Maybe my colleague Kristin shares this, about the sort of technocratic force that maybe is taking our profession down the road of, this is a ticket-based system. You just fill out the form. Everything that Graham does is quantified by his requests into the stacks, and he can then at the end of his month make sure that he's hit his quota of requests, polls, what have you. And I'm not saying that is a outdated mode. We have kind of started to just recently get into that habit, which is valuable in a lot of ways. We can do the sort of data analysis to that effect. But we can't even really crawl our data in useful ways yet. And we've been generating it for maybe 10 years now, if not more.
I think we're ready to wind down. I wanted to know if there's anything in closing. We've all talked. There's 4 people's voices and brains in this. So if you're like me, you have a lot of like ideas that you didn't get a chance to speak about. But as maybe a closing thought, I wanted to ask Graham and Kristin if our conversation brought up anything. And if not, if you had a message for artists or the social justice orgs that have created a lot of the box sets with us, that Graham, I know specifically you've collected, like if there's any messaging you would want to offer them in terms of like what you see in their work or how to, I don't know, encourage their continuation.
Yeah, I would just say, the work that gets made that then gets brought to our doorstep by y'all is continuously inspiring to the community that we serve. And I think what is important about having that material become part of the system, the ecosystem that ends up in an archives, in an academic library, is that you cannot foresee the inspiration or potential use of that stuff going forward. And that is historical. I would say only that the future is yet unknown. The work will continue to be served to the public. And that's kind of the role that the archivist, Booklyn, and the social justice-minded, archival-minded artist can kind of collaborate on for the future.
In terms of the perspective of the budding artist who is engaging with the work, I think that they and we just have to stay as disciplined and active as we can possibly be to make sure that we don't get lazy about what is available to us to engage with, to be inspired by, to be curious about, because that can also happen. And we are all just constantly encouraging one another to keep at it. We're just going to keep at this that we've been doing, and we're going to just try to stay as active and involved as we can.
Thank you so much, both of you, for talking with us. We so deeply appreciate our relationship with you, and we look forward to talking with you in the future.
We would love to. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much, Monica and Marshall.
Yeah, you are so welcome, and thank you. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
And I want to say thank you so much to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Booklyn Calling. As usual, check out our show notes. We'll have more details about Kristin and Graham and their work in archival collections. And if you're an artist, an archivist, or a librarian at an educational institution, and you're interested in working with us, you can email us always at hello@booklyn.org, and you can always check out our entire collection at booklyn.org. This podcast was made possible in part by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and in partnership with the City Council, and from individual donors to Booklyn, Inc. You can support this podcast by making a donation at booklyn.org/donate.